time. Okay. Welcome everyone. I know that there are lots of people online. Welcome to all of you online, including a big class of students up on the 8th floor. Glad you could join us for this event. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. My name is Rebecca Thiessen. I'm a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies here at the University of Ottawa. I'm the co-director for the Research Network on Women, Peace and Security. It's a national network, but also the co-director with Margaret Jenkins on the Gender, Peace and Development Research Network here at the University of Ottawa that falls under the Centre for International Policy Studies, CIPS. Thank you to CIPS for all of the coordination and work that they've done. Lots of wonderful staff are here with us, and we really appreciate all the work that they've been doing. And now I'd like to introduce our panel. We were so delighted to hear that Karen was coming to present the research along with some of her team members. So this event is strengthening the representation of women in diplomacy, challenges and policy solutions. And if you look on the CIPS website, there's a summary of the event, but there's also not very clear, but there is a link there, a hyperlink to the report. So if you want to read about this report, it's there, and it's a really wonderful resource. My students are reading it, we're discussing it, and it's a great document. We have two presenters today. We're joined by Dr. Karen E. Smith, who is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. And she is also the director of the LSE IDEAS Women in Diplomacy project. And alongside Karen, we have Marta Kozalska, who is the co-founder and manager of the Women in Diplomacy project at LSE, where she oversees the project's vision and activities. So they're going to present the work that they've been doing. It's a work in progress. We know that there's a more formal report that's coming out in 2026 that we'll look forward to. After their comments, Lily is going to, I'll introduce properly. Dr. Lily Nichols is a professional in residence here at the University of Ottawa in the School of International Development and Global Studies, and has served as ambassador to several countries. And she's going to talk a little bit, share some thoughts and reactions to the presentation, and maybe even share a little bit about some of her recent work, a publication that she's just put on the CIPS website, which is How FIAP has broken glass ceilings. And it's a really great think piece, really connected to this conversation. And so she'll serve as discussant and get the conversation started. I may ask a few questions to the panelists as well. And then, of course, there'll be plenty of time for questions from the audience, both here in the room and also online. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will happily read them out so that you can hear responses to your questions. All right, without further ado, welcome everyone, and welcome to our presenters. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for hosting this event. We're delighted to be here. Just a word initially about LSE IDEAS. It is part of the LSE. It's a think tank on international diplomacy and strategy, which connects academic research and the policy world. So the work there is explicitly policy oriented and is trying to bridge the so-called gap between academia and practice. So we started this project to address a number of empirical puzzles, which are coming up. There we go. One is that women are not at the table. And these I did when I was sort of thinking about presentation and visuals and all the rest of it. All of the photos I'm showing you are from 2025. I did not dip back into the archives, right? So these are just random. And these are like the first 3 images of negotiations that I came across. Table on at the table on Armenia, Azerbaijan, all men. The table on South Sudan, all men. This is Russia, United States, Ukraine, all men. This is 2025, all right? So women are not at the at all. And why? Then the other empirical puzzle is vividly seen in this graph, which this data comes from a wonderful project based at University of Gothenburg called GenDip, which is counting ambassadors around the world, collating all of this wonderful information. Okay, the line's going up, but it's still under a quarter, right? Of the world's ambassadors are women, right? So less than a quarter of the world's ambassadors are women. So why is this? So the Women in Diplomacy project was launched in 2022, precisely to explore this underrepresentation of women in diplomacy, as well as the misrepresentation of women in diplomacy. To understand, because it is policy oriented, to understand the obstacles to representation and how they can be overcome, and then to make policy recommendations to try to improve the representation of women in diplomacy. And back in 2022, we gathered a team led by Marta and me, of people who women who had worked on diplomacy or on women in diplomacy or women, peace and security, those kinds of topics. So they were sort of a sounding board and helping us with literature review, helping us with ideas and so forth. So we gathered this particular team of experts, and we initially looked at the literature. What does the literature tell us? What's there already? And there is quite a lot on gender in diplomacy. I mean, Rebecca has contributed to it as well. Often those studies of women, or until recently, those studies of women's involvement in foreign policy and diplomacy have been focused on Western countries. So there's less on the global South countries, or even just on non-Western countries, even in the global North. It's increasing, but there's still large gaps in the literature there. There are lots of studies on women's leadership in other sectors, in academia, for example, as heads of university, or in the loads of information out there on the corporate world and in national politics. Fewer studies on women's leadership in international organizations and negotiations. That is growing now, but there's a legacy of hardly any attention to this in the past. We are focusing then on this curious intersection, or this curious sort of coming together of the national and the international levels. So that literature, for example, on barriers to women's leadership at the national level gives us hints about what women may face, but in a complex multinational environment, there are other challenges and opportunities, right? So it's a peculiar context. And in fact, we've heard even quite recently about how traditionally ministries of foreign affairs have been almost sort of isolated from discussions about gender parity, right? In other words, you can talk about it with every other ministry, but as soon as you get to the heart of sovereignty, we can't really look at it there. So we want to look at that particular context. And then we wanted to know what does the literature tell us about obstacles to women in leadership? Three glasses, I'm going to call them. The first is the familiar, the glass ceiling, or as some have said, the concrete ceiling. And so it really hurts the head to go up against it. And we see that women tend to occupy half or more of positions at lower levels in foreign ministries, not around everywhere, but increasingly there is a there are more women coming into the more junior levels in foreign ministries and international organizations, but obviously then as you get higher and higher, you find fewer women. They're bumping up a glass ceiling. There's a particular bunching of women in mid-level career positions in diplomacy. Then there are glass walls. Women tend to work on so-called feminine sectors, interpret that as you will, development aid, women's issues, and they get clustered there and find it very difficult then to move into other so-called masculine sectors, such as, say, hardcore security, nuclear security. Those kinds of issues. And then there are the glass cliffs, and I keep thinking about this as we hopefully UN Secretary General is appointed. That is a woman. However, they will be appointed at exactly the moment in time when the United Nations is facing a huge crisis. And this has tended to happen, that women, openings for women to exercise leadership can happen when the organization is under stress, when there's turmoil, budget cutbacks, and so on. Other obstacles to women in leadership include the gendered perceptions of women's capabilities and even their appearances. I mean, Madeleine Albright even wrote a book about Read My Pin. So she would send messages about the pins that she wore on her clothing because she knew that people were looking at her clothing, right? Closely at what is Madeleine wearing, right? So these gendered perceptions can be detrimental. Then there is outright sexism and sexual harassment continuing today. For example, female diplomats at UN climate talks in 2023, and not only in 2023, but they reported being harassed and intimidated in the corridors of the conference, and that prompted 24 countries to complain to the United Nations about it. This is ongoing both within foreign ministries and in these sort of international negotiating contexts. And then, of course, there are the inflexibilities in the workplace, which are particularly hard for diplomats. Childcare, balancing of sort of childcare and caring responsibilities, just general work-life balance, and support for trailing partners, right? One particular issue is whether or not your trailing partner can work in the country where you are going to be posted. I mean, that can vary by country to country, which can make it extremely difficult, but also the very long hours that diplomats work or are expected to work. It seems to be a culture, a norm of extremely long hours, of always being available 24/7. And the further away you are from the capital in terms of time zones, the worse that can get. And then, of course, those challenges are even greater for women from underrepresented groups. I mean, diplomacy, of course, is largely for elites. I mean, you've risen up through elite universities, you've risen up through you're helped by a kind of a support network, which is greater for those for elite women. And so those kind of challenges for underrepresented groups around the world are even greater. So we conducted these literature reviews, looked at these obstacles, and then we talked to senior women. We have a podcast series which is available on Spotify. And in the initial stage leading up to this first report, we interviewed 12 women. We started out with Ngozio Condri-Reala, who generously gave us her time when she happened to be at the LSE. And then we gathered interviewed with a number of other senior women. And the kinds of questions that we asked them were about those biases and barriers. We wanted to know what they thought they had to break in order to be able to hold the leadership positions that they hold. We wanted to know then what helped, what was useful, what did they need in order to try to break those barriers. We were then interested, I mean, this is a thorny question, about whether or not women do things differently. I mean, there is a huge debate here. Some of it might essentialize what we think are women's characteristics. But we wanted to know what they thought, right? Did they think that they did things differently to their male predecessors? And did that have to do with their gender? Right? Was it something that they were conscious of? Do they think that women really lead? Did they think that gender influenced the goals and priorities that they were pursuing? In other words, were they conscious of the fact that they had perhaps some sort of responsibility to do things differently, to do things for women in their leadership positions? And then we wanted to know whether they thought their gender had an impact on their success or not. So we wanted these kind of questions. What did they think? I mean, this isn't universal, but what did these particular mean? And then, of course, we asked them, well, what needs to change? How can we strengthen women's representation in international diplomacy? What can practitioners do? What do foreign ministries need to do? International organizations need to do? What can researchers do? So we asked the literature review, plus then the kind of information that we had from these public conversations, as well as a few private conversations, which we've been having with women diplomats, helped to feed into the first version of this report. And I'll hand over to you.
And thank you, Rebecca, for convening us, and Lily for joining us, and welcome everyone. So I'll just speak a little bit more around what we did with all these findings in terms of our first report and lessons learned. And of course, we wanted to essentially start putting down the trends and patterns we were seeing across these different conversations we were having across the literature. But the answer is, when you go into detail, they did differ at different planes and kind of points. But we essentially published our inaugural report in June 2024 to address the barriers and the policy solutions we were learning about through that process. And we wanted to do it in a more systematized way. We published it knowingly that we won't be capturing everyone's experiences and everyone's views, because we're not capturing everyone's voices here. But again, as I said, we wanted to start putting down the trends and patterns as a starting point to the conversation, rather than having different points and different kind of notes and notebooks. So we published that report as a starting point to a conversation. And what we learned through that process and through putting the report together is, first of all, that individual leadership matters. Obviously, we want to change kind of the structural barriers and put measures that kind of advance women across the board, but individual leaders can make that happen as well. So we spoke with a lot of women leaders who already instituted different measures within their ministries of foreign affairs or within their diplomatic practices, for example, by introducing childcare centers, flexible working practices, etc. So that really, really does matter. Then we kind of learned about supportive career development practices and how important they are, both in terms of formal and informal practices. So in terms of formal career development practices, we're talking here about, for example, training and capacity building. And through training and capacity building, also making sure that everyone is trained, not just women, for example, and that it is really key to make sure that everyone really understands the benefits and the value to diversity in decision making, to ensure that everyone's on board and understands really what we're doing and why we're doing this. And that we are not trying to exclude men, we're trying to include women and include everyone for that matter, and that it benefits everyone the same. In terms of formal institutional support, other measures include rethinking recruitment practices to make it more inclusive and accessible. As Karen said, diplomacy is still widely inaccessible, so really rethinking not just kind of advancing women, but how can we make the practice of diplomacy more accessible in general. Flexible working and childcare support measures were the kind of top ones that we found. When it comes to informal forms of development, really one of the strongest trends and patterns that we noticed were the importance and how much difference can mentorship and support networks make. So mentors and senior mentors to junior and vice versa, really any forms of mentorship and role models really, really supported women across the board. And even just forming networks at kind of the same seniority level supported women in kind of exchanging best practices, exchanging their kind of worries, boosting their confidence. Imposter syndrome is a huge thing we've heard about. So mentorship and support networks really made a difference here. Then again, we kind of mentioned here about the importance of underlining the value and benefits of diversity in decision making. And I think we want to here convey that diverse participants bring diverse perspectives to the table, and I think it's as simple as that. And it helps produce stronger and better policy outcomes, increase organizational credibility, etc. So we spoke with a few women, for example, Ala Morabit. She stressed that women should be a part of political processes as key constituents, because not only are they impacted, but they will also bring different perspectives to the table. And sometimes they also have access to parts of society that men may not be able to access. And through that, women leaders also, can make a difference in how they do diplomacy and how they do policy and how they advance those goals. So women do tend to include a focus on women's rights, inclusion, reach out to underrepresented groups. So again, kind of how you do diplomacy really differs and matters. For example, Farid Bensouda ensured that sexual and gender-based violence systematically it was included in ICC investigations and prosecutions. And Catherine Ashton, every single time she traveled, made a point of meeting with groups of women in conflict and crisis zones, and that definitely made a difference. So what we did next was really bringing these barriers and kind of lessons learned together in a set of recommendations. And as you look at them, they may not be groundbreaking, but I think that's kind of the message we also want to send. These are fairly simple measures, but in a lot of places they're not being instituted. But we do believe that even if you make that one step and institute a few measures, that make a difference. Canada is much more advanced than kind of many other places we've been to, but at the same time, it would be really great to hear what you think about these recommendations and where they are present and where they might be missing. So we started off with kind of really underlining the importance of creating and implementing, not just having a plan, but really implementing a plan to enhance gender equality and diversity within the organization. A lot of organizations might have a measure here and there, but they don't have that kind of stark, clear commitment to gender equality. And obviously that should and needs to operationally start with senior leadership, who really kind of has to be present across the organization. To be able to create such a plan, we need to understand also what the situation within the organization is. We found that a lot of ministries of foreign affairs and international organizations are not gathering gender disaggregated data. So they are almost blind to the problem, and whether they are choosing to be or they just are, they don't really realize what the problem is and how bad the problem is of underrepresentation because they don't have the data to support it. Then we wanted to underline the importance of internal and external gender equality efforts, because we do see this trend of ministries and international organizations, establishing these really, really ambitious plans, women in peace and security agenda or feminist foreign policies. But then what we find is that they're often externally focused and they don't actually look inward. So they're kind of have really ambitious aid allocation goals or economic empowerment in kind of their countries, but they don't really look inward and they don't really think about how we can advance inclusive kind of governance, inclusive representation within the organization, which would also help advance these agendas in the longer term. Then recruitment processes, it's obviously a big one, and it's not just about kind of thinking about who's in the panel. Is the panel representative and inclusive? What are the questions? How are the questions asked? Are kind of tests anonymous if they can be, but also who's in the pipeline. And that's why we really want to underline here the importance of advanced thinking about recruitment, not just where we are now, but where we want to be in the future. So who's getting into that pipeline and why, and if people are not, what can we do longer term to really build those individuals up to be able to progress through the ranks. So really thinking holistically about recruitment rather than just, who's on the panel for the interview we have tomorrow. Formal and informal career development support, we already mentioned that in the lessons learned, but formal from training and capacity building, recruitment, it all kind of overlaps to informal. And here, I think we just want to stress the kind of the mentorship, the support networks that really, really need to matter. Building design and making facilities inclusive and accessible. And we find that manifested in different ways, but for example, oftentimes gatherings, conferences don't really think through how the day is designed, when networking happens. Oftentimes networking happens in the evenings when women have to attend to childcare responsibilities and are excluded from really key discussions. Are there kind of accessible bathrooms if women want to or have to bring children? Do they have the facilities to do that? It's really rethinking kind of these little daily practices to make diplomacy much more inclusive. And finally, making social inclusion and gender equality non-negotiable and making its benefits known to everyone in the organization. I think we shared enough about this, but really it's just about conveying the message of the benefits of diversity in decision-making, how it aids mutual understanding, it sheds light on issues that otherwise may have not been considered, and really contributes to more integrated and inclusive organizational culture as well. So we kind of laid out these recommendations again, just to kind of start the discussion. And we wanted to start discussing kind of the viability, but also is there anything further than this with diplomats, practitioners, experts? We want to hear from you today as well. So what Karen and I did was we launched our phase 2 of our project, which sounds very monumental.
We didn't know that.
Yes.
Inventing the phases.
Yes,
as
we
go
are.
along.
It's very the project's growing organically. We were not kind of masterminds as we would like to think of ourselves. But the first edition of the report, as I said, it was a basis for further dialogue and discussion to start just bringing these learnings together. And what we're doing now is we're continuing public conversations via podcasts. So we have the second series of the podcast, and I'll show you the names of women we engaged so far on the next slide. We continue to publicize the need for benefits of greater representation through a variety of activities, but more importantly, what we're doing is we're traveling across select cities and countries to talk to diplomats, practitioners directly to dig deeper into both the barriers and solutions, but also do exactly what we were not able to do with the first report per se, is talk to more people first of all, but also make it more representative. So what we're trying to do, for example, is we're not only trying to speak with people from that city or country where we are, but we're trying to bring diplomats who have been posted to that city as well to try to understand viewpoints from different kind of experiences, backgrounds, and perspectives, and that is ongoing. So we will share kind of those lessons learned in our next edition of the report, which will come out hopefully in Q1 of 2026. And these are the women that we've been able to speak to so far as part of podcasts. But as I say, in addition to the podcast and kind of the online discussions we're having, we are doing a grand tour and speaking to diplomats directly as well.
And so just to share a few of the things that we're discovering in phase 2, I mean, the mentorship, I have to say, comes up in every single conversation. It is incredible how often they mention that, but other things that we are learning. First of all, this real problem of bunching in mid-career positions. So for, Tuesday, we were talking to women based at women working at the UN, representing their countries at the United Nations. And, it was pointed out that there are many more, almost twice as many deputy permanent representatives to the United Nations that are women than there are permanent representatives to the United Nations. And that's just a pattern that is everywhere, that you see everywhere. So there's a real problem of this bunching. And then leaving. This is where the pipeline leaks, right, at that mid-level position. We also, this has come through, and we had not appreciated this before, but the long kind of running impact of stress and women's health issues on women. These are, there's that stress of always being judged, always having to be on guard and so on, but also then just general women's health issues just are not addressed at all, right, are pretty much ignored, possibly both by foreign ministries, but also in the wider kind of literature and public policy-oriented materials. On the work-life balance, then, we're trying to dig down into getting, what can we concretely try to recommend, or what do diplomats themselves want us, because we're hoping to kind of serve as a voice that amplifies their own particular views, so they can then take the next version of report back to their foreign ministry and say, look, this would be a great idea, why don't we do this? So we've been trying to gather their views on how work-life balance could be addressed. One was ensure provision of childcare. That's not just in the foreign ministry, but also in the various embassies, right? Directly in the embassies. And this has happened in some cases, but obviously it's not universal. Enabling couples to serve abroad together. That would be up to both the diplomats, obviously. Negotiating with host countries to enable trailing partners to work in country. I mean, it was kind of suggested, why isn't this just universally reciprocal norm? That around the world, you can bring your trailing partner to work. That should just, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Immunities right now works against that, but this is where we could see some change. Replace dinners and evening receptions with lunches and other events during working hours. And we know of one ambassador who did do this. while she was serving as an ambassador. I have to pick my kids up in the late afternoon. So this is what we're going to do. I'm the ambassador, I'm the boss. This is how we're changing it, which is great. But then you wonder what happened after she left post, right? You know, does that particular innovation last? And ensure that all work regular office hours, right? I mean, there are some appalling stories we have heard of unbelievably long working hours, 24/7 effectively. Then we've heard some interesting discussions about how one could build flexibility into a diplomatic career, because there is a particular problem. I mean, we know that women have the caring responsibilities, and we've not yet overcome that particular cultural expectation. But why in particular, when your kids are young, couldn't it be possible for diplomats to have male and female, to have an off-ramp in which they're based in the capital, they work in other ministries, right? For I don't know, 7 years or whatever, but then they have an on-ramp, which takes them back into diplomatic service, but at an appropriate level. In other words, they haven't lost out in their career trajectory by taking this kind of sidestep, and then they come back where they should have been, right? Because they've got all this other experience in other ministries. Then this has also been mentioned to us, make training on gender and unconscious bias mandatory and regular, right? It's not just for new entrants, but it's a regular thing. Boost mentoring schemes. I mean, the mentoring is just this, again, like we've been saying, this has come through again and again. It's something of very importance. And encouraging networks, but also ensuring that networks of women diplomats, of LGBTQ diplomats, and so on and so forth within those ministries feed into discussions within the ministry. In other words, they are consulted on personnel policies, right? So that they become part of the formal decision-making process within those ministries. And then, I mean, it's unbelievable that we have to say this, but ensure that work is a safe space for women and combat harassment also online. We want to talk a little bit more, gather more views on combating misogyny online, because diplomats are visible, right? You are the target. And you know, how could diplomats deal with that particular kind of harassment? And then finally, data. I mean, data on what the levels are, what the pay gaps are, who's being posted where, when, for how long, how are various and sundry sort of inequalities coming in. You can't know that unless you have the data and are gathering the data. So these are just some of the insights and solutions that we've been hearing thus far, and that we would hope to incorporate into the next version of the report that will be due by the end of the quarter we're giving ourselves the end of March of 2026. So thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to hearing all of your views and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And one of the great things about the report is that there's so much voice within the report too. And so we can listen to the podcast, but you can also get a little bit of that voice also from the report, which is really rich. And I think tells these really amazing stories. I have a few questions and comments, but a lot of the things as I'm writing these comments are clearly coming up in the feedback that you're receiving. So I'll come back to some of those later, but I want to first ask Lily to just share a few reactions and reflections, and also, if you wish, some of your own personal experience navigating these things.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And thank you, Karen and Marta, for this excellent research that you're doing. So important, so timely, especially at this time where we're living in a very turbulent world, where a progressive and an inclusion and diversity agenda are under threat. So it's very important to keep these issues in the limelight and to press how important it is to address them. So congratulations on this very, very important work. My main reaction is that I agree with everything. So that's it, my work.
Gonna have coffee.
the research, the insights, the lessons learned, the recommendations truly resonate. For someone like myself who spent 26 years as a diplomat in the Canadian government, and somebody who was part of the formulation of Canada's feminist international assistance policy, and then intentionally went overseas to be a head of mission to try to implement the FIAP. It's what you're seeing is very much part of the experience that I've had over the last 6 years. What I thought would be helpful maybe was for me to kind of reaffirm some of the key messages that you have so many rich findings in there, but there's 3 that really came at me. So I want to maybe take a few moments to kind of highlight how important those are based on experience. And then maybe I will mention another 3 sets of issues that I think are also part of my experience and that I think are worth doing further research on and further reflection on. So in terms of the 3 things that I think that you're highlighting that are really, really important. The first one is the importance of networks, of mentoring, mutual support between female diplomats, and also building critical mass. And here's an area where I think that Canada in 2018, by not just introducing a feminist foreign policy, but also by agreeing and committing itself to 50% of Canadian diplomats. I think that was like something that it was a tipping point. It was a takeoff point. And I was part of actually that group in 2018 that it was for the first time that of our diplomats sent abroad, our heads of mission sent abroad, were women. And I often hear from some of my own mentors, diplomats who were, women ambassadors 20 years ago, that it changed things. It changed dramatically, that they felt isolated, while by having that critical mass, you could have that mentorship and that network. And I think it's one of the things that Global Affairs Canada actually has done very well. We do have an ambassadors, a female ambassadors network. And I can tell you from experience that during COVID, for example, in particular, there was tremendous solidarity in that network. Many of the female diplomats were left alone, serving 24 hours a day, trying to repatriate their citizens, Canadian citizens back home. And a lot of the solidarity and the advice and the coaching that happens in that network was essential. And it varied from issues of menopause, how to handle manuals, and mansplaining. So all these little things and lots of humor as well, lots of jokes, and even some solidarity too. One of the things that the Canadian women diplomats have done that I find very beautiful is that we have one Canadian diplomat, Ambassador Deborah Chatzis, who was the first Indigenous woman and lawyer to become a Canadian diplomat. She passed away much too young from cancer, but she had a dress that we called the Deborah dress. It was like a red dress with a big Canadian maple leaf. And the Canadian women diplomats to this day rotate the dress all over the world. And each woman, female ambassador, wears it to commemorate Deborah, who really broke important ground by being an Indigenous and female and brilliant Canadian diplomat. But in addition to that, the networks also provide, as you pointed out, training before diplomats go out and mentoring every year. For example, Global Affairs Canada, both virtually and in person, does what they called, like an annual kind of, virtual and in-person mentoring session with young incoming diplomats, not just women, but men as well, right? So these functions, I agree from my experience, are essential, right? The other thing that I think you really are very right to highlight is how, as women diplomats, we do experience diplomacy differently, and we do diplomacy differently. We also, and that also means opportunities and unique challenges. It's both, right? So sometimes you can have a unique opportunity. For example, as a diplomat working in Afghanistan, because I was female, I was able to meet with girls being educated very secretly. It actually involved an experience where we actually had to go through 3 locked doors just to get to a little room where little girls were sitting on the floor learning the alphabet. No men were allowed in that space, right? Or, for example, in Bangladesh, when Rohingya women, refugee women, spoke about some of the experiences of violence that they had experienced as refugees, only women were allowed in that space. Although at one point they did allow Minister Sajan to sit with them. But that was very rare experience. So it does give you access to spaces that if you were not a woman, you might not have access to. But at the same time, it represents a series of challenges. You've mentioned many of them. I experienced, for example, when I was ambassador in Panama, that there was a group called Los Mondongueros, and it was like a male club that would not allow women. This is like, in 2021, they would not allow any women to be part of this club. Yet it was like the elite of the society making important decisions. So for a diplomat, that kind of access is very important. There was one female diplomat, it was not me, it was before me, who tried to insist that women participate in this men's club. And she was not listened to. And this goes to show you how difficult and how restricted some spaces are in the world of diplomacy. And in this case, in a country that was actually quite open and very inclusive and had strong women ministers. So it can happen in any context. The third thing that really resonated with me, although it's in your paper, we didn't talk about it too much today, is the importance of intersectionality, right? And we all know this from experience that yes, gender and the fact that you're a female diplomat affects the way you're going to work, the issues you're going to pay attention to, but it's layered, right? So your ethnicity makes a difference, whether your mother makes a difference, what your training does makes a difference. And in my experience, for example, when I was in Latin America, the fact that I'm a Latina Canadian was just as important as being a female Canadian who had been part of creating the FIAP. So these layers of identity together is what makes a difference. And one of the unique things about diplomacy, especially when you get to be the head of the mission, is that it's one of the few times in our career where you bring your identity into your work and you use it to leverage access, to leverage networks, right? So those multiple identities, not just gender, but ethnicity, religion, class, all of those will come together and present a series of opportunities and challenge, right? So I think that's really important. Now, a couple of things that I wanted to add based on experience that I think are important to explore further. One is that women's networks are not always easy to maintain. One of the things both in Panama and in Bangladesh, we had in the country a women ambassadors network. And in both cases, it was extremely difficult to maintain those networks. In the case of Panama, it was difficult for political reasons. So for example, we only had about a dozen female ambassadors out of over 50 ambassadors. But when we tried, for example, to convene together, some of the women ambassadors were opposed to us inviting the Venezuelan, because at the time, Venezuela had an official ambassador and the Guaido interim government ambassador. So some women, depending on whether you recognize the Guaido government or not, some women would say, I'm not going if so-and-so's invited. We had other women ambassadors who either were with Ukraine, supporting the Ukraine or supporting the Russian side of the war. And again, would not meet if the meeting was all women ambassadors. So politically, it can be very complex. In Bangladesh, we had an experience where the Western and Nordic women ambassadors were actually quite critical of human rights record in the country. And when we met, we addressed those issues and we spoke about how we wanted to to advocate for women's rights against child marriage. But some of the diplomats from the South Asian and Southeast Asian countries had a different diplomatic approach. They did not want to in any way be seen to be critiquing or challenging governance issues in any way. So we had a hard time meeting together. So just to say, it's not always easy, and because we're women diplomats doesn't mean that our views or our approaches or our perspectives are homogeneous. They're quite far from that, right? The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was about the challenge of resistance and backlash. Okay, this is something that it would be really interesting. We got to look at. It's a big challenge. In my experience, when you're promoting a diversity and inclusion and a gender equality agenda, you have to be ready to face some resistance. In Bangladesh, we received a lot of resistance because we had a very active campaign against child marriage. Even though child marriage was illegal in the country, it was still a practice. Canada had projects with Plan International and with World Vision to try to work at the community level, including with the mullahs, with religious leaders, to challenge that practice. And we faced a lot of resistance. So that's part of the situation. And then backlash sometimes to your promoting a gender equality agenda. In Panama, I remember that one of the things we did was to work with Embera, indigenous women, to help them build a community center. And I remember visiting the Embera to celebrate the opening of this community center and being summoned unexpectedly by the male indigenous chiefs. And they told me I had to come alone and they wanted to meet with me. And my team was quite nervous. Because it could have become a violent situation. Luckily for me, my driver insisted that he was not leaving me, and he came into the room and stood right behind me. And but basically, what the indigenous chiefs were saying is, why are you only giving money for women's projects? Like, we are also poor. Like, you need the money for the men too. And I agreed. I thought it was quite legitimate concern. And so we took that into account. So that is a backlash that is maybe legitimate. We have to be careful not to go bend backwards the other way and to exclude men. I mean, we need them as allies. And again, my experience has been that it was when I had male allies, both in my ministry in Ottawa or both overseas with fellow ambassadors, that we could do more and we could have more impact and more credibility. So I think the importance of a male role is very, very critical. I'll add just two more areas. One is what I called the challenge of organizational coherence. And you alluded to this. And that is, for example, in the case of Canada, because we had a feminist international assistance policy, we often assumed that the gender equality agenda was for the development side of things. But it was extremely much more challenging to pursue a gender equality agenda when it came to trade or when it came to security issues, right? So I've actually, Professor Thiessen mentioned that I actually wrote a paper about the implementation of the Feminist International Assistance Policy from my experience. And it talks a little bit about how important it is to have like that whole of ministry, that whole of government agenda where this cannot be just relegated to the development sphere, right? And as you have pointed out, training is very important for this, but also I think it's important to have some money, access to money and expertise. One of the things that helped me most, for example, to promote gender equality in the security sphere was having a Canadian Women and Peace and Security Ambassador Jackie O'Neill, who had expertise, who had that role, who would come to the country, speak to generals, present data and evidence as to why women, for example, needed to be part of peacekeeping processes. So having access, without having had that access to that research and expertise, I would not have been able to be as influential. And together we actually not only visited generals, we visited civil society, we wrote an editorial in the country's national newspaper, but you need that expertise and you do need some seed capital to support support in your country those women's alliances and networks and projects. One of the best things that Canada has is something called the CFLI, the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. It is very small amounts of money, but if you use them strategically, you're able to blend, that the gender equality policy with supporting local women's rights and local initiatives. And then lastly, but very, very importantly, is the issue of what I call policy coherence. And this is your foreign policy coherence beyond the organizational level when it comes to different issues. So for example, it's not enough to have a gender equality approach in your development projects unless you're also taking a similar approach in your trade negotiations. Or, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, one of the main challenges in the country is that the ready-made garment industry is very successful. It's attributed to the country's poverty reduction, but it has been also presented a lot of challenges for women. And some of the work we've done to support that sector has been based more on safety and security, legitimately so, because you may have heard that 10 years ago, there was a tremendously harmful accident, the Rana Plaza accident that killed many workers. But one of the things we did was to make sure that it wasn't just about, building environmental safety and building safety, but infusing a gender equality, women's rights agenda to the women who suffer tremendous amounts of harassment, low pay, exclusion from senior positions. So your foreign policy then has to be holistic and coherent. You cannot have a progressive, inclusive agenda in one sphere and not so in another sphere. Same thing, for example, in mining. Canada is a mining nation. And of course, the job of an ambassador is to promote Canadian mining. But again, do you do it in a way that is like gender sensitive, that includes Indigenous women's roles in the mining sector? Do you include environmental standards? So the way you do it matters. So those are just some areas that come to mind when I read your work. But congratulations once again on amazing work.
Thank you very much.
So much, Lily, and a few things that I wanted to pick up on here. Thinking about how, as Lily says, women diplomats do diplomacy differently and tracking what that looks like. And I think that's really good evidence base. I think we should have better representation for the sake of better representation. That's a starting point, but also having some of that evidence. And it's not to say that your research should necessarily do everything, but just to encourage people to, to do that kind of research, to get better insight on what impact not just women diplomats, but any diplomat that practices a feminist approach to doing diplomacy. And then I just wanted to ask if there's a difference in your research, if you're looking for this, between countries that have feminist foreign policies and better representation and also supports and mentoring and all of those things. Canada, of course, has 50-50 in the ambassador positions. Germany has done something interesting here in Canada. The ambassadors to Canada, I don't know if you know this, are sharing a position, a husband and wife. And so, that's one of those ways that, in terms of addressing some of the issues of the partner and making sure that they have meaningful work as well. But you have lots also to reflect on from Lily. So I'll give you a chance to respond and then we'll have questions from the audience.
Just on that, I mean, there is obviously, there, countries with better gender equality records tend to have better representation of, it's feeding through at least. But it isn't entirely the case. And we are going to be in UAE in November, and UAE obviously would not necessarily come at the top of any gender equality scoreboard. But they are our strong supporters of a Women in Diplomacy project and program, and trying to get more women into diplomacy and representing the UAE. So it kind of depends. we can discuss all of that, sort of, we want to find out more about that. So it isn't only particular countries. There could be, for example, one could hope that, as Ann Town's research had originally shown, that finding yourself, comparing yourself to other countries and finding that you're at the bottom of a league table doesn't look very good, and that you might therefore want to take some action to try to not look quite so bad. So doesn't entirely flow through. But as for absolutely. I mean, wonderful. Thank you very much for all of the additional insights, and particularly additional insights. And that will hopefully the next version of the report will see some of those in that as well.
Great. Okay, well, let's take some questions. We'll keep an eye on the online as well. Feel free to put a question in the chat online for those of you not in the room, but let's take some questions from the room to start while we're waiting for those other questions to come in. Reflections, comments? Yes, would you mind introducing yourself very briefly?
Miss Zara, I'm an undergrad in politics and economy. My question is for Dr. Nicholas. During your time in Afghanistan, did you ever felt like unsafe as a woman? And how did you manage to ensure your security during that time?
And if it's okay, I'll take a few questions and then we'll have the panel respond. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Völkel. I'm here at the university and I'm from Germany, so one of the countries that have been mentioned. I would have two questions, maybe short ones. The first, you mentioned female diplomats might do their job differently than male, but I was not sure to understand if you already noticed structural differences. And I ask with the background, Karen, if I may say, we both have published on emotional diplomacy last year with Seda and Özlem. And I'm still working on emotional diplomacy. And the question of gender, of course, is kind of elephant in the room then. Yeah. How are problematic cases discussed on diplomatic tables between female and males? That would be the first question. And the second question would be, since you try to reach out to female diplomats, why not reaching out to people who have not made it into these top positions, who failed or dropped out at some point? So the invisible women in diplomacy, wouldn't that make sense? Thank you.
That's a really great question. I was also thinking about how tech-facilitated gender-based violence is also preventing people from even going into these positions. Did you have a question also?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sunita. So I'm both here at U Ottawa and also at the other foot on the other side at University of Carleton. So I just wanted to ask a question. I mean, there's a lot of talk and that we were having in this conversation about mentoring and about support network. And I'm just wondering if you had noticed an exhaustion. There is an exhaustion within creating these spaces, as you were saying, Dr. Lilith, about managing those networks or keeping those networks. I'm just wondering, what are the kind of exhaustion, and particularly when we have now more, how would you say, the alternate right kind of ideology that is sipping into the governance framework. So how is that, if that had come up, and how has that been handled within this conversation? Thank you.
Three great questions. We'll come to another round in a minute. So can we start with the response from you, Lily?
Yeah, so regarding Afghanistan, I was working there in 2010, so it was extremely insecure. We did actually get bombed at one point and had to go into what we call red alert, but that was for everybody. As a woman diplomat, you were very restricted in the spaces you could go into and in the way that you could look. I mean, I was very covered up. And in the way you got treated as well. I remember distinctly going to meet the Minister of Education, Minister Admar, and he was like, I was the head of the Canadian delegation, and he kept looking at my junior officer, who was like the one male. And my officer, whose name was Larry, kept saying, it's not my fault, but he only talks to me, So that's a reality. You have to face that, right? And what you do in that situation is that you simply, in a very diplomatic way, because you're a diplomat, you continue engaging with your agenda, and you do eventually, they do catch on that you're the one leading the conversation here, right? So you have to have a lot of chutzpah, in those situations. And yes, it is, it can be quite dangerous. And, for most of you as a young generation, a lot of our development programming is now in fragile and conflict states. Well, I mean, the state of the world is such. So you will likely in your lifetime be working in a fragility context, in a context where you might be quite restricted by the local culture or religion, right? The Canadian government, of course, takes good care of you. We have tremendous amounts of layers of security and a very strict protocol. So you're not on your own. In terms of the networks, right? My experience has been that everybody's extremely committed to these networks. And by the way, it's all volunteer work. It's not really part of anyone's paid job. It's all done voluntarily, but if anything, I find that people want to do more and more. They're extremely motivated. One of my regrets is that the networks some networks don't connect with each other at times. So for example, in global affairs, I mentioned that we have a very strong women diplomats network, both here in headquarters and usually in each of the countries. Yeah. But we don't, I think, intersect enough with the other networks in the department. For example, I'm also part of the Latin American network that has been created, and the two rarely meet. So I think that we should take more of an intersectionality approach to the networks themselves.
Excellent.
Okay, on whether women do diplomacy differently, bring different kind of characteristics, and whether those are because they're more emotionally literate or whatever, which is you can sometimes hear. I mean, some of the literature says that they do because they have a different approach to management. I mean, there's that so-called people versus process or output kind of focus. I mean, there were some of our interviews. I mean, you can listen to it. It comes through in some of the podcasts that they do think that they were more attuned to the needs of their staff, right? That they were more attuned to perhaps the room, reading the room. Whether that's them or whether that's because they're women, I mean, we can get into that. But there were some of our interviewees who did think that they were doing things differently, and that had to do with their gender. Right. Some quite forcefully actually put that forward. If you listen to some of the podcasts, we've had this question just on that. You can add anything you want. But why have we not talked to women who have failed? We've had that before, and that question before, and I think part of it is because, I mean, we have talked to some groups of much more junior, or even those wannabe diplomats who are trying to take exams, right? To take the diplomatic exams and the kind of pressures they are under. We haven't talked to those who have failed to do so. I mean, part of it is because we anticipate that there would be a very different story, and perhaps, full of rancor and all of that. But that's not what we're trying to focus, I think, much more on how to overcome the barriers. How did you do this, right? So we just, we're just the two of us. It's like there's only so much that we can do in the immediate focus. On the exhaustion, I mean, I think there is, you could argue, two perspectives. One is that individual character is under. I made it because I worked my butt off, because I was super prepared, because I worked all night to make sure that I walked into that meeting, I could raise my hand first, and I talked from a position of authority. I put in the hours. I did all of this, right? I succeeded because of pure graft. Well, also innate characteristics, intelligence, all the rest of it. And so versus a perspective that might be the structure is inherently unequal, is difficult, it's challenging, right? So you can get two kinds of advice. One is you need to be more prepared. You need to do this. You need to make sure that you walk into the room super prepared, be better than the men, right? I mean, that's, my mother told me that, right? Ages ago. And so I think, and that itself can be exhausting. And I'm not entirely certain that younger generations would hold to that particular view with the same kind of intensity that we have heard from some. So there is this sort of, we have tried to stay away from that lean in kind of literature, just lean in, right? To say, well, it could be that, there are things that individuals need to be aware of, but there's also these other wider contexts, right, that are operating and that you need to know kind of how to navigate. So some of that is, exhaustion can come from batting up against these structures and these biases and these perceptions constantly. And if you've done it forever and ever and ever, you might, consider retiring early. I think possibly has come across for all sorts of people. How is the alt-right? Who asked that question? Alt-right. I mean, it's interesting. We were in one of these dialogues that we run with women diplomats. And this was actually a few months ago. So we weren't, we were at the beginning of this. Who just said, we can see the tsunami coming. And we know exactly what's about to hit us. We just have to know that we are going to be overswept by this tsunami of far-right, misogynistic, highly anti-diverse kind of this stuff, right, that we see. And another then said, but we wouldn't be facing the tsunami if we hadn't been so successful. So she was trying to inject a note of optimism because yes, we can see the tsunami. There wouldn't be a backlash if there wasn't anything there hadn't been a perceived threat in the first place, right? It's because there is this perceived threat to, shall we say it outright, white male supremacy that then provokes the backlash. So there was, she was, I think, trying to buck everybody up and, we've been here before, been there, done that. We can do it again. There's we know what to say. We know what the arguments are because we've been saying them for years and years and years and years. So there is absolute awareness that we have seen in these private discussions of what's happening and what we're facing. Everyone is facing and concern about how to do it. And I think some mutual support going on there in attempting to do so. Anyway, I'll hand over that.
I'll just add a few things, but I completely agree with this Lily and Karen here. So I think in terms of would you want to do diplomacy differently? There's kind of 2 or 3 comments here I wanted to mention. I mean, I do agree with what Karen says, and a lot of them, would have a lot of our conversations in our conversations, they underlined the kind of feminine qualities in terms of communication, being kind of listening more, so being attuned to kind of the needs, but also being more proactive, and that was either because they wanted to be, but also because they felt they had to be because they needed to do so much more just to kind of be visible and kind of be in the organization. And from that also come different other issues of kind of time poverty and not having enough time to kind of do kind of all the other things that potentially male counterparts may be able to do. So that's both a positive and kind of negative. What we also mentioned is kind of how to do diplomacy and what they end up doing. And here also there are 2 sides to it. One, women might want to kind of shed light on issues that otherwise wouldn't have been kind of taken into consideration. On one hand, it might be because they're grouped in those kind of feminine portfolios. On the other hand, because they're more interested and again feel more attuned and in position to be able to do so. So it does help at least expand kind of perhaps kind of the issues that are being taken into consideration and the questions that are being asked in relation to different policy areas, for example, like Lily said, to be able to kind of integrate those considerations across those policy areas. But at the same time, I wouldn't say it was unison across the board. It almost kind of felt sometimes cultural in terms of how certain women were able and felt confident to be able to kind of leverage up their kind of feminine qualities and bring that into leadership, and how some said it's only purely on merit, kind of gender is invisible, you know, even though we see kind of the structures that kind of are barriers, but because of their cultural background, they also kind of led with a slightly different rhetoric and how they choose to see kind of their positionality and also leadership. When it comes to, yeah, speaking with kind of invisible women, I echo what Karen said, and I think we do try to, through the conversation we're having, again, kind of expand our view, not just in terms of backgrounds and kind of ethnicities and experiences, but also ranks. So we've tried to kind of also speak with junior and mid-rank women. And I think obviously that the experiences will be different and the feelings will be different, but I think that the barriers that they mentioned, it's not like they also have been successful the first try. They already have their different barriers that they mentioned. So I imagine, I would like to think that some of the barriers they mentioned would be kind of similar to what other women would say as to why they potentially didn't make it. And in terms of exhaustion, I mean, yes, it's just an additional thing women have to organize to kind of create support systems for themselves. But I think kind of almost what Lily said, it gives you so much more benefits in return that kind of the exhaustion almost, we didn't feel like it was a recurring theme, because even when we organized these kind of workshops to talk, it gave them such a positive kick of just being able to exchange best practices or even vent and have that time and space to be able to do that. So they really, really enjoyed investing time and effort into coming or organizing themselves to be able to do so, because it almost made their day-to-day easier, but also shares best practices that they're not able to get from their kind of formal workplace. So we've seen that there's a lot of value in that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. We'll take a few more questions. There's still nothing from online that I can see, but do correct me if I'm missing anything. But I know you have questions, so we'll go to you first.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I was fascinated that the 3 examples that you used in the photos at the beginning are actually all peace processes. And that's the area of my research, is women's participation in peace processes. And, you know, typically of academia, some of these literatures are a bit siloed from each other. But that has, I guess, some good reason, because they are, there's lots of peace practitioners are not usually representative of states, foreign policies of which diplomats are the voice of, be antithetical to peace processes in several cases. But we do see all of those examples. I mean, Sudan is an internal conflict, but very heavily mediated by IGAD and neighboring countries. But the other examples are interstate conflicts, and peace negotiations are shifting, peacemaking is shifting as a consequence of shifting nature of conflict now, from interstate to interstate conflicts, but also the failing capacity and legitimacy of the United Nations to take that role. And states are also purposefully, like Qatar, purposefully making these processes part of their foreign policy. So inside of all of this, I mean, women also are always excluded from peace processes on all levels, the track 1 that we see there, but also track 2, more present in track 3, but that's not where the diplomatic corps is operating. So I guess in this sort of intersection between diplomacy and now into peace processes, are there specific, you know, are women sort of positioned in slightly different ways, rather than as a broader, you know, when they're dealing with other diplomatic issues, of which there are many, in this sort of subset of diplomatic sort of concerns, do they feel positioned in a certain way, constrained? You know, there is all of this somewhat problematic literature, or the argumentation of women's role in peace processes. It's always make peace, you know, and it comes back to that centralization of women. But yeah, how do you see that particular capacity that they play when they're also coming diplomats that have agendas that they are not able to, that they are being told to do? Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really great question. Your name?
Oh, sorry, I'm Jenna Sapiano.
Nice to meet you. Yes, two last questions from here, and then there's one that got sent to me that I'll try to find. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Armand. I'm a first-year master's student at the School of Political Studies here at U Ottawa. My questions has a similar frame as others, but slightly different as it relates more to the research that you're doing, so mainly directed at Karen and Marta. We know that there's been obviously a rightward shift of the Overton window in recent years, and there's a large increase in right-wing and even far-right governments worldwide. So my question is more so like, how is this impacting the research that you're conducting? For example, if a woman diplomat, cannot speak as openly about these issues in fear of breaking with or perceived to be breaking with the policy of the government that has posted her to that position. For example, like how is your research going to make sure that it isn't only gathering data from women diplomats who represent governments who are willing to seriously consider these issues, and the vast array of women that work in diplomacy who now represent the majority of democracies worldwide, which are right-wing and far-right.
We'll take the last question at the end there. Just before we do, the question that's coming from online is from a student in the classroom. Would you expect to see similar patterns with women's participation as civil society participants in international diplomatic spaces? COP or the UN, CSW. All right, and the last question.
Yes, thank you. So I'm a political science student here at U Ottawa. And I just wanted to touch on one of the points that were mentioned. And so Dr. Nicole, you mentioned the example of Panama and exclusive elite male societies. And then Professor Smith and Marta also mentioned among some recommendations for the foreign ministries and international organizations, you mentioned social inclusion and gender equality. And so my question was, how do we institute a shift in traditional networking male spaces, for example, country clubs or like Dr. Cole mentioned, societies? How do we institute that shift? Do we wait for them to open it up? And really, what's the recommendation moving?
Great. And then I think we have to give you some time to respond. We have about 6 minutes left. Margaret, do you want to ask
Yeah, just actually jumping on your point and we're talking a lot about the far right and pushback. I just wanted to flag that obviously there's a lot of female leaders on the far right. There's this very strong right women's movement. So it'd just be interesting to hear your reflections on that. And so then there's this tension between ideational diversity that can be piggybacked with women's representation, not necessarily, right? So you can increase women's representation. There's a lot of women. I mean, a lot of people are surprised how many college educated women voted for Trump and still would. So yeah, just how your paper might engage this kind of issue.
Yeah. We'll start with you.
Go for it and I'll.
Okay, all right. On women's exclusions from peace processes, I mean, so there, for example, I mean, it was also because one of my colleagues who studies the Middle East pointed out that all of the negotiators dealing with Gaza were male. And that might have been just because that's the way it crumbled. So you just happen to have male foreign ministers all over the place, right? But that's also indicative, right? But that's why Cathy Ashton said that she was doing a practice that she had learned from Hillary Clinton, which was when you're going to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal or the Serbia-Kosovo deal that she was heavily involved in, she made sure to do side trips because she knew that the voices at the table were going to be quite male. The men with the guns get to the table. Else gets to the table, and so therefore she had to go solicit these other views so that she could in a way try to represent them at the table. So we are looking only, I mean, there is that literature also that shows that when women are included in peace negotiations, you get longer lasting, better peace deals. But we are looking principally at those that are holding those formal diplomatic positions, which links to the one with the CSOs on the civil society organizations. I would expect to see more women in than in the formal government positions, but not always, right? There's still a problem in that sector as well. But again, we're I just Martin, we're just looking at the women in the formal diplomatic sectors. How to shift away from those spaces that exclude women. Yeah, I mean, we're in London, we're based in London, where what's the name of this exclusive club? Oh, which includes why can't I think of the name? Where just to get women into the door, and then they're like, no, we'll let in Maggie Smith, but nobody else, kind of thing. And I would hope that Maggie Smith's like, I wouldn't be a member of that club if you pay, but anyway. I mean, that's the story, that's the history of the process. But that is then about trying to figure out how you do get those, make sure that the voices are being heard, even if you're not on the golf course letting Trump win. And those, Alex Stubb, president of Finland, has been quite successful in using that space in order to try to gain some kind of an entry. But women also have their spaces, I think, as you pointed out, Lily. Far right movement, including women leaders. I mean, here, here I'm sort of on the representation itself matters, and that we can't say we only are interested in, because obviously pro-gender equality people can be men, right? It's not a case of we only allow representation for pro-gender, that's the thing that we're most interested in, is that overall change. I think that the representation itself has to be the starting. So, women are allowed to screw up without, damaging prospects of half of humanity. And so that we have to, that's the starting point, diversity of views. One could hope that would change, but that's a kind of a political argument. So I'm torn on that one, but on the other hand, so we only want male fascists. It's a tough one, but I do think we start with the representation problem, getting to the, and its interest, it has affected our research. So there are certain capitals that I'm not entirely certain we would get anything interesting out of if we went there to have a conversation, because views would be guarded, but also because of the prevailing kind of norms, and you'd get a political argument straight back at you, rather than some of the less guarded views that we have heard in countries. But when we go to places, we do speak to diplomats that are based there. So we are speaking to a wide variety of diplomats from around the world, who may not include some of the countries that are less open to female leadership than others, but constitute the large majority of countries in the world. I don't know if you would.
Erin, I'll add some general thoughts, but I think Erin put a lot of ground here in terms of peace process, and nothing kind of too tangible to add, apart from the fact that we know the research, the research, there is kind of very tangible data to back that diversity in peace processes and involving women in peace processes and make them more sustainable. I think it's like 35% more sustainable across the kind of the 15-year mark. So I think we try to underline that as an example, but as Karen says, I think our approach is quite general for now. We have been thinking about trying to kind of silo out a few different policy areas we could focus on, but hopefully in the future we will be able to. When it comes to kind of the right-wing shift and how it's affecting research and kind of not being able to speak out, it is. Sometimes we're worried if we're in certain spaces, do we speak out? Do we not? Obviously we do, and we continue to, and we publish and we write, but even we are kind of considering that. Obviously differs in context and countries where we go, and sometimes we feel more comfortable, like here, and sometimes we don't. Yes, but I think you have to do whatever feels right for you. You can't push it, obviously, and we know the consequences. I think the only thing I would say is continuing to kind of push the agenda forward through other means, whether it's kind of more informal for the time being at least, but also we've talked about, and we've had these questions before around how do we advance that agenda within that current context, and I don't have the exact answer to it. I don't have a one-liner you can take away and kind of promote, but it's all around also reframing how you position that issue. So I was talking to someone who was having the same issue with climate in the US context, and how do we kind of push ahead with the climate agenda, and they kind of thought of a very cunning way of kind of reframing the issue of kind of really putting what the current administration or people that you talk about care, and just reframing the issue to kind of make it their idea and make it seem like it has benefits. So I'm still kind of ideating and thinking about it. Once I have it, I will let you know, but I encourage you to think about it as well, and kind of really thinking about the reframing of the issue rather than dropping the issue altogether just because we are in a dip. When it comes to civil society, I agree with Karen. I think in general there's more prevalence with women, but at the same time, for example, we had a conversation recently in New York where we heard women diplomats say we had to institute a change within, for example, the UN to allow more civil society in general and civil society and women representatives to hold spaces in these key negotiations because they're not included. So again, it's just kind of advancing that agenda and kind of seeing where the exclusion happens and who really needs to be included. When it comes to the networking, great question. I think I'm just going to repeat, for example, individual leadership matters here, whether it's a man or woman, just being able to ask them and for them to come out with the initiative to make that change. I think that's all that it is needed. And we've seen that happen. It's fairly easy to do. You just kind of take networking from this space and this time to bring it to lunch here instead of a golf club. It sounds easy, but I mean, it is. just need the commitment and will. But also just if you're not in a position to do that, I mean, I think to the extent possible, just call out and try to get men on board and make those changes. But I also agree that kind of organizing in other spaces. So again, kind of the own networks kind of do matter here. And the pushback, I kind of completely agree with Karen here. I think, it's not an issue for men, right? No one has the same question around men. And I know why we have the question around women here. So maybe that's why kind of the idea that really put forward in terms of critical mass comes in here. When you have more and more women, it kind of dilutes a little bit. It's less tokenistic, so you don't really zoom in on that one woman that is in that place, but you have much more representation, and you kind of see it's kind of part of life rather than oh, she tripped and now women can't be in a position of power. So yeah, I don't have a very good answer. I mean, it's a really good question, but I think the only way I would answer it, and I would continue to try to encourage to view it as is that.
We had one question come in online from Stuart Shaw with the Canadian High Commission in Trinidad and Tobago. Very interesting question. So he asks, I mentioned the idea of, how did it come up on screen, of coming up, having lunches instead of dinners. And we are now thinking about how we address the issue of resource poverty, in particular foreign ministries and diplomatic services, which has come across quite starkly in some recent visits that we've had. The only thing, so that is an issue, it is problematic. One thing interesting that has come out of some conversations is some have mentioned, we had conversations in London, that London was a good posting because there was respect for the weekend. In other words, that there was, and I'm guessing that came from the diplomatic community, but also from the FCDO. There's understanding that Saturday and Sunday are fairly sacrosanct. And so that then seemed to relieve a bit of the pressure on the diplomats posted there that they were going to have to work all weekend. In other words, they were almost given permission to also have a weekend, right? And so that way that in particular contexts, there might be particular norms that are set out by the foreign ministry there in that host country that can enable a better work-life balance. But obviously that's something that has to be kind of disseminated throughout every single capital city. But that's, we're very aware of the issue of the resources, of the disparity in the resources amongst foreign ministries and how that can make a difference.
I think it has all been said beautifully.
We've gone over time, and that's a good indication of how interesting this panel was and the discussion. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your fantastic work that you're doing. I know we keep telling you to do more, so grow your team and expand. That would be my dream. Congratulations, and thank you so much.
Thank you.